They carried him the last few yards themselves, because he asked them to, and because by then there was nothing else he wanted from the world but this, to be set down on the bare ground of the Porzioncola, naked as the day his mother bore him, so that he might die owing nothing to anyone, not even to the shirt on his back. It was the 3rd of October, 1226. Assisi lay quiet in the valley below, its stone houses catching the last gold of an autumn evening, and in a small hut beside the little chapel he had rebuilt with his own hands 30 years before, Francis Bernardone was dying. He was 44 years old, though he looked older. The desert years and the fevers of the East and the long fasts had worn him down to something like a lamp with the oil nearly spent, all flame and no fuel. His eyes had been ruined for more than a year, burnt half blind by the cauterizing iron the doctors at Rieti had pressed to his temples in a last, desperate mercy, and still he could not see the brothers weeping around him, only hear them, only feel the rough wool of their habits brush his skin as they lifted him, and the wounds. Even now, even after 2 years, the brothers who tended him could not look at his hands without their own breath catching, the raw, dark marks driven clean through palm and instep, as though nails of iron still lodged there, weeping still. His side, too, opened and never healed, as if some soldier's spear had found him after all, 11 centuries late, and decided he would do. These were no metaphors, no bruises of the spirit dressed up in pious language. They bled. Brother Leo, who loved him best and understood him least, had washed those wounds 1,000 times with his own hands and still wept at the sight of them, because there is no getting used to a miracle, not even when you live inside it. "Lay me on the ground," Francis said, or something very near it. The brothers remembered the sense of it more surely than the exact words, because grief does that to memory, blurs the edges of a moment even as it burns the center of it into the soul forever. "Lay me on the earth, and when I have breathed my last, leave me there a while, naked as I came into the world." They knew better than to argue with him. 30 years of trying to talk Francis out of poverty had taught the order that particular lesson well. So Brother Elias, who governed the friars in those days and who loved Francis with a stern, complicated love that history has never quite untangled, gave the order, and gentle hands lifted the dying man from what little bedding he had and set him down on the bare dirt floor of the hut. No mattress, no blanket beneath him, nothing between Il Poverello and the ground that had always, in some sense, been the only property he ever truly claimed. 6 feet of Italian soil, and even that only on loan. You have to understand what this moment was, and was not. It was not despair. It was not a man stripped and broken by the world, defeated at last by his own extremity, crawling back to the dust in surrender. Quite the opposite. This was a wedding. Francis had spent his whole life courting a bride nobody else wanted. He called her Lady Poverty, and from the day he tore the clothes from his own back in the piazza before his father and the Bishop of Assisi and all the watching town stood there naked in the cold air of a February morning in 1206, giving back to Pietro Bernardone even the shirt he'd been clothed in, so that he might say from that day forward, "Our Father who art in heaven," and mean it with his whole undivided heart. From that day, poverty was never for Francis a hardship to be endured. It was a homecoming. It was the truest way he knew to empty a cluttered house so that God alone might fill every room of it. And so, of course, when death came for him at last, he would not meet her wrapped in anything borrowed. He would meet her the way he had lived, with nothing in his hands, so that both hands might be entirely free to receive. The brothers who gathered that evening, and there were many of them now. This ragged little band that had grown from 3 men in torn tunics kneeling before Pope Innocent III, to thousands scattered across Italy and beyond, though only a handful stood in this particular hut on this particular evening. The brothers understood, or came to understand, that they were not watching a man lose a battle with illness. They were watching a man arrive, every fever, every fast, every winter night in a cave near Greccio or a cell at Laverna, every mile walked barefoot on the roads of Umbria, preaching to peasants who could not read, and to a sultan who could. Every single choice of Francis's whole strange, luminous life had been aimed like an arrow at exactly this hour, and now the arrow had found its mark. He asked for bread, and someone brought it, and in the fading light he blessed it and broke it and gave it to the brothers gathered close around him, the way another man had done in an upper room a long time before, on the night before his own dying. Francis had loved that story his whole life, had wept over it in every mass he was ever privileged to serve as deacon, had once wished aloud that he might understand it not with his mind only, but with his body, and God, it seems, had taken that wish with a terrible and tender literalness. Then he asked that someone read to him the Passion according to St. John, the account of the dying of Christ, and one of the brothers, perhaps Leo, perhaps Angelo, the record does not insist on which hand held the parchment, read it aloud in the failing light while Francis lay listening with his ruined eyes closed, tracing in his memory a passion he had spent 20 years trying to live rather than merely to admire. And then, when the reading was finished and the bread was eaten and the small dark room was full of the sound of grown men trying very hard not to sob aloud and mostly failing, Francis began to sing. He had written the song himself, most of it, some months before at San Damiano, in the very worst of his blindness and his pain. Those weeks when the disease of his eyes had grown so agonizing that he could not bear even the small light filtering through a shuttered window, when mice ran over him in the dark hut Clare's sisters had built for him in their garden and would not let him sleep, when by any human reckoning he had earned the right to despair, or at least to silence. Instead, in the deepest dark he had ever known, Francis had heard, he said it himself, later to the brothers who asked him how such a thing could come from such a night, a voice promising him that for this suffering, so patiently borne, there was reserved for him an inheritance so vast that all the trials of this life would seem set beside it, no larger than a grain of sand set beside a mountain. And Francis had sat up in the dark, sightless, in pain past what most of us will ever have to bear, and instead of a complaint he had made a song. Altissimo, onnipotente, bon Signore, most high, all-powerful, good Lord, tie sole laude, la gloria, e l'onore et onne benedizione. Yours be the praise, the glory, the honor, and every blessing. He praised Brother Sun first, who brings the day and light you give us through him, beautiful and radiant with great splendor, bearing the very likeness of the Most High. He praised Sister Moon and the stars, clear and precious and comely, formed in heaven. He praised Brother Wind and every weather, cloudy or serene, every kind of weather, mind you, the storm along with the calm, because a man who has made poverty his bride does not get to pick and choose which providences he'll bless. He praised Sister Water, useful and humble and precious and chaste. He praised Brother Fire, through whom you light up the night, beautiful and playful and vigorous and strong. He praised Sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, producing every kind of fruit and colored flowers and grass. And this This is the part that ought to stop your heart, if it doesn't already, is the man lying naked on the bare ground of the Porzioncola, blind, bleeding from wounds that no physician of that century or ours has ever been able to explain. Having given away literally every last possession he ever owned, including at the end the very shirt off his back. This is the man singing to the sun and the moon and the fire and the earth as brother and sister, as kindred, as fellow creatures caught up together in one great chorus of praise before the same good Father. He owned nothing, and because he owned nothing, everything in creation belonged to him the way a brother belongs to a brother, not by deed of purchase, but by bond of blood. There is a stanza in the canticle that Francis had not sung before that autumn, one he composed in those final weeks when he knew, the way the dying sometimes simply know, that the road was nearly walked. He added a verse for Sister Bodily Death, from whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin, he sang, but blessed are those she finds doing God's most holy will, for the second death will do them no harm. He had made peace, in other words, with the very last enemy, had gone out to meet her, not as a stranger dreaded and delayed, but as one more sister in the great family of creatures, ready to walk him the last mile home. So there in the darkening hut, naked on the ground he loved, Francis sang it again. His voice by then was thin, worn down by fevers and fasting and 40 years of hard use, but the brothers said afterward that it did not falter. Some of them, unable to bear their own grief in silence, began to sing with him, badly, brokenly, through their tears, because grief makes poor music, but God, I think, has never once in 800 years minded poor music sung in love. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water, Brother Fire, Sister Earth, our Mother, Sister Death, round and round the great litany went, this dying man's whole theology distilled down to a handful of Umbrian verses, simple enough for a child to learn, and vast enough to hold the entire created universe inside them. Everything visible and invisible bound up together in one enormous act of thanksgiving, offered by a man who had spent his life becoming small enough to see it all clearly. The sun went down. Somewhere outside, in the fields and hedgerows around the Porzioncola, the brothers would later remember, though it was well past the hour when such birds keep their voices still. A great flock of larks descending, circling low over the roof of the hut in the last light, crying out as they wheeled, as if unable to keep away from that particular patch of ground on that particular evening. Larks love the dusk no more than any other bird does. They are creatures of the dawn, of first light, of the hour when the world wakes rather than the hour when it sleeps. And yet there they were, wheeling and calling over that small roof as the light failed, as though even the birds of the air had come to sing the Poverello home, the way he had spent a whole lifetime singing to them. He died as the last color went out of the sky. Quietly, the record says, no great struggle, no final cry, only the long day's work of dying finished at last, the way a man finishes a stretch of road he has walked since morning and simply, gratefully arrives. Naked on bare earth, blind, wounded, penniless, without a coin to his name or a possession to his memory beyond the tunic the brothers would presently, tenderly put back on him for burial, and received in that same instant by more than earth alone. The brothers who stood in that hut never doubted for one moment what door had opened for him, or who was standing on its other side. Word went out from the Porzioncola that night, the way word goes out in small towns, mouth to mouth, door to door, up the hill to Assisi, where by morning the whole city would know that the poor little man from the Bernardone house, the merchant's son, who had once loved silk and songs and swordplay, who had torn off his clothes in the bishop's courtyard and gone singing into the hills, who had begged for stones to rebuild a ruined chapel with his own 2 hands and ended by rebuilding something far larger than any chapel, that this man was dead, and that all Assisi should come and see how a saint goes home. They came, of course they came, but that crowded morning, and Clare weeping at San Damiano when they carried his body past her window so she could kiss his wounded hands one last time, and the long procession into the city, and everything that followed in the years after, the tomb, the miracles, the great basilica raised in stone above the poor man who owned no stone at all. That is a story for later chapters, and this book has many pages yet to walk with you before we come back around to it properly. For now, hold only this scene, because it holds everything else inside it the way a seed holds a whole tree. A man with nothing, singing to everything. A man blind in his eyes and radiant everywhere else. A man who spent his whole life learning to be small enough that God could be enormous in him, and who died, at the very last, naked on the ground he had loved as a sister, and was received, that same October evening, by every single thing he had ever praised. Sun, moon, wind, water, fire, earth, and the good Lord who had made them all, and who was, in that failing autumn light, at long last, making Francis new. That is where his story ends. It is also, and this is the whole reason for the pages that follow, exactly where it begins. Picture the shop first, because that is where he lived, before he ever knew he was living for something else. Bolts of cloth stacked to the rafters, Flemish wool, French silk, dyed scarlet and deep blue, the kind of color that cost a fortune to make and a fortune to buy. The smell of new fabric and old coin, a boy's hands running along a bolt of fine cloth, the way another boy might run his hands along a horse's flank, feeling for what makes it worth loving. That boy was baptized Giovanni, John, by his mother Pica, while his father was away in France on business, buying and selling the fine stuffs that made the Bernardone name good in Assisi's markets. Pietro Bernardoni was a cloth merchant, and a shrewd one, the kind of man who measured the world in bolts and ducats, and knew to the coin what a bargain was worth. He loved France, its fairs, its language, its songs, the whole glittering commerce of it, and when he came home from one of his journeys to find his wife had named the boy for the Baptist, he would have none of it. He called him Francesco instead, little Frenchman. It was half a joke and half a boast, a merchant's pride in his own trade stamped onto his own son, and nobody in Assisi ever called the boy anything else again. I want you to sit with that a moment, because it tells you something true before the story even properly begins. Francis did not choose his own name. It was given to him out of someone else's love of something else, his father's love of France, of profit, of the wide world of commerce that stretched beyond the walls of one small hill town. And for the first 20 years of his life, that is more or less the man Francis seemed content to become. Pietro's son, Pietro's heir, a boy being fitted, bolt by bolt, for his father's life. He did love it, understand, and there is no use pretending otherwise, because it is part of what makes the later turning so astonishing. Francis loved beautiful things. He loved fine cloth against his skin and better cloth in his hands to sell. He loved the songs of the troubadours that drifted up from France with the merchants and the pilgrims, songs of courtly love and knightly honor, of ladies won and battles fought for glory. He had, by every account that has come down to us, a beautiful singing voice, and he used it, walking the streets of Assisi at night with his friends, composing verses, spending his father's silver like a young lord who had never once in his life had to ask what a coin was worth. He was, in the phrase his own biographers used without a trace of embarrassment, the king of the youth of Assisi, not by election exactly, nobody handed him a crown, but by the plain gravity of his charm. The other young men of the town, the sons of merchants and minor gentry, gathered around him the way people gather around a fire in winter. He organized their feasts. He led their processions through the streets after dark, torches and song, the whole company trailing him like a comet's tail. He paid for it too, more often than not. Pietro's coin again, spent as freely as if it would never run out. There is a story, well worn by now, but worth the telling, of Francis in the shop one day, bargaining hard over a sale of cloth, and the beggar coming to the door, asking alms for the love of God, and Francis, so caught up in his haggling, waving the man away. Then, mid-sentence, something in him snagged. He left the customer standing, ran out after the beggar, and gave him everything in his purse. His friends teased him for it later. He didn't seem to mind the teasing nearly as much as he minded, for that one strange moment, having said no to a man begging in God's name. Hold on to that story. It is a single loose thread in a very fine garment, and in time the whole garment is going to come apart along that seam. But not yet. For now Francis is 20 years old, admired, generous, a little vain about his clothes. He was known to wear his fine garments half finished, part rich fabric and part rough patch, sewn together, less out of poverty than out of a kind of restless flair, as though even his tailoring couldn't decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He dreamed, like every young man of his class and his century, of glory, not merchant's glory, his father's kind, measured in warehouses and trade routes, but knightly glory. The troubadour songs he loved were full of it, banners and horses, ransomed ladies, honor won on a battlefield. Assisi in those years was a free commune, hard won free of its bishop and its overlords, and it kept armed men, and those armed men went to war the way merchants went to market, as a matter of course. Francis wanted, more than almost anything else in those years, to be a soldier, to be a knight. He had the money for the armor. He had, everyone assumed, the courage. He got his chance sooner than he might have wished. Assisi's old enemy was Perugia, the larger and prouder city across the valley, and the two towns had been grinding against each other for years, the way two stones grind in the same current, sometimes a shove, sometimes open war. In the year 1202 it came to open war in earnest. The forces of Assisi marched out to meet Perugia's army near a bridge over the river at a place called Collistrada, and it went badly. Assisi's line broke. Its soldiers were cut down or scattered or, if they were of a class worth ransoming, taken prisoner, and Francis, young and eager and dressed for the part, was among the captured. They marched him back to Perugia in chains with the others, and there he stayed in a Perugian prison for the better part of a year. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant, because we tend, all these centuries later, to slide past a phrase like held prisoner, as though it were a minor inconvenience, a delay before the real story starts. It was not minor. Medieval prisons were not built for comfort. The men taken at Colestrada were held for ransom, sorted more or less by what their families could pay, crowded together in close quarters with poor food and worse air, and no fixed date on which the waiting would end. Some of them despaired outright. There is a memory preserved of one companion in that cell, a nobleman fallen into gloom, sullen and bitter at his captivity, cursing the whole arrangement of a world that could put a man of his birth in chains, and Francis, of all people, going to him and cheering him, laughing off the misery with a confidence none of the others could quite account for. More than that, Francis told the other prisoners plainly that he believed he would one day be venerated throughout the world. Read that again and feel the strangeness of it. A cloth merchant's son, sitting in a Perugian cell with a ransom on his head and no particular reason yet to think God had noticed him at all, announcing to his fellow captives that greatness was coming for him, not knightly greatness, not the glory of the troubadour songs, but something he himself could not yet have named. His companions, we're told, took it as a young man's bravado, the kind of thing captives say to keep the dark at bay. Perhaps he half meant it that way too. But 800 years of the Church, remembering this story, tell us it was not only bravado. Something in Francis already knew, long before Francis knew it, what he was for. He did not know it yet in any way he could have explained. That's important. This is not the chapter where the crucifix speaks, where the leper is kissed, where the fine clothes come off in the public square. This is the chapter before all of that, the chapter where a bright, spoiled, generous, ordinary young man is broken down slowly, almost accidentally, by the plain machinery of war and captivity and a body that has had enough. Because when the ransom was finally paid, Pietro's money again, the same silver that had bought Francis his fine clothes, now buying back his son's freedom, and Francis came home to Assisi sometime in 1203. He did not come home the same young man who had marched out. He came home sick. Whether the illness had begun in the prison itself, in that close and airless confinement, or set in only after his release, the record does not say with certainty, and I will not pretend to know what the doctors of the tradition themselves were not sure of. What we do know is that it was long, and it was severe, and it changed him. Weeks became months. He lay in his father's house in that fine merchant home on the street that still bears the family's memory. And the fever came and went, and his body, the same body that had worn silk so easily, that had danced and sung and led the youth of Assisi through torch-lit streets, wasted under him. He had to relearn how to walk. He leaned on a cane in his own courtyard, like a man 3 times his age. And here is where the story does something no war and no prison had managed to do. It began, very quietly, to open him. Because there is a particular grace that comes only with a long illness. You may know this yourself, if life has ever laid you flat for months instead of days. And it is this: the world does not wait for you. It goes on being beautiful, being ordinary, being itself, entirely without your permission, and entirely without needing you in it. Francis, propped up in a window, or leaning at last on that cane in the courtyard, looked out at the hills of Assisi, the vineyards, the olive groves, the same soft Umbrian country he had ridden and sung through 100 times as the golden young king of the town's revels, and it looked different to him, not less beautiful, stranger, as though he were seeing it, Bonaventure tells us, almost for the first time, and finding that it no longer satisfied him the way it once had. This is the moment the tradition calls the first cracking of the silk, not the falling away of the fine clothes that comes later, and it comes all at once, publicly, in a scene we will linger over properly in its own chapter. This is something quieter and in its way more mysterious. A boy who had always known exactly what he wanted, glory, admiration, the crown of the young man's feast, a knight's name to make his father's merchant name look small, lying in a sickbed and discovering that none of it, not one particle of it, tasted the way it used to. He got up eventually. The fever broke. The strength came back into his legs, and within not too long a time Francis was doing what any young man of his spirit and his century would do the moment he could stand again, making plans to go back to war. There was talk of a great lord, Walter of Brienne, gathering knights in the south for glory and papal favor, and Francis, restless, ambitious, still hungry for the honor his illness had not quite managed to kill in him, bought himself a splendid new suit of armor and set out to join the campaign, sure that this time the crown he wanted would finally be his. I will not tell you yet what happened on that road or what stopped him before he had gone even a single day's journey from Assisi's gates. That belongs to the next turning of this story, and it deserves its own breath, its own quiet. But I will tell you this much now, because it is the hinge this whole chapter has been swinging toward. The young man who rode out that second time, gleaming in his new armor, was not quite the same young man who had ridden out to Colestrada full of untested confidence. Something had already gotten in under the silk. A prison had done it a little, an illness had done it more. He did not yet know what God was doing to him, he thought. God help him, that he was simply recovering his health and going back to claim the glory that had eluded him the first time. But the boy who wanted to be a king of feasts had already met, without knowing her name yet, a poverty he had not chosen, the poverty of a body that fails, of a captivity that humbles, of a world grown suddenly stranger than it used to be. And it is always like this with God. If you watch closely enough across the lives of the saints, he rarely announces himself in the moment of our strength. He waits, patient as a lover. For the moment the fever breaks and we are lying weak in a window seat looking out at hills we no longer quite recognize, and only then does he come close enough to whisper that everything we thought we wanted was never going to be enough. Francis did not hear that whisper yet, not in words he could have repeated to you, but he had stopped for the first time in his young life entirely tasting the world the old way. And the man who has stopped tasting the world the old way is a man who is, without knowing it, already being fitted for something else entirely. The horse smelled it before Francis did. That is how these things often go. The animal senses first what the man has spent his whole life refusing to smell. Somewhere on the plain below Assisi, on a road he had ridden 100 times without incident, the horse stopped short and would not be coaxed forward. And there, standing in the dust where the road bent toward the leper hospital at Rivotorto, was a man wrapped in rags the color of old wounds, his face eaten half away by the disease, his hand out for alms, the way it had been out for alms every day of a life nobody wanted to look at. You have to understand what a leper was to a boy like Francis, not merely sick, not merely poor. A leper was the visible edge of the world where God's blessing seemed to run out, bell ringing, quarantined, legally dead in some towns before the body caught up with the paperwork. Francis had spent 20-some years arranging his life so that he would never have to come close to one. He gave alms to beggars freely. His father's silk had bought him that much generosity. But he gave from horseback, at a distance, the way a man tosses bread to dogs he does not want near his boots. The smell of a leper turned his stomach in a way nothing else on earth could. He had told friends as much. He was not ashamed of it. Everyone felt it. So when the horse balked that day, Francis had a choice he had made 100 times before. Turn, ride wide, drop a coin, and be gone. And by every account that has come down to us across 800 years, something in him simply refused to make that choice one more time. He got down from the horse. He walked toward the man he had spent his whole life walking away from. He put money in the ruined hand, and then, this is the part that still catches in the throat of anyone who hears it rightly, he bent down and kissed him. Not the hand only. Some telling say the face, ravaged as it was, marked with the very thing Francis feared most in the world. And in that moment, he tells us in his own voice, in the testament he dictated on his deathbed, with nothing left to gain by lying, what had been bitter to him was turned into sweetness of soul and body. Read that sentence slowly, because it is the hinge of the whole conversion, the door swinging on it. Not, I overcame my disgust through willpower, as though sanctity were a matter of gritting your teeth. He says the bitterness itself was turned to sweetness. Something happened to him in the actual kissing that could not have happened by resolving to kiss lepers from a safe distance in his imagination. God did not ask Francis to admire the poor. God asked him to put his mouth where the world's disgust lived, and in that contact changed the disgust into joy. He rode away from that road, a different man than he arrived on it, though it would take him time yet to understand how different. He began going to the leper hospitals, not the grand occasional gesture of the merchant's son doing charity, but returning again and again, tending wounds, giving alms, sitting with men the town had already buried in every sense but the literal one. Something in him had found the place where he was needed rather than the place where he was admired, and it turned out those were two entirely different countries, and he had been living his whole life in the wrong one. It was not long after this, though we cannot say exactly how long, that Francis found himself drawn, as a man in the middle of being remade is drawn to quiet, ruined places, the way you seek out a room that matches the state of your own heart, to a small chapel outside the walls of Assisi called San Damiano. It had been a place of some devotion once. By the time Francis came to it, the roof had begun to fail, the walls were crumbling, and the old priest who kept it lived on whatever scraps of charity found their way to so forgotten a door. Nobody of consequence prayed there anymore, which is, perhaps, exactly why Francis did. Above the altar hung a crucifix in the old Byzantine style, Christ not slumped in death the way later ages would paint him, but alive, eyes open, gazing out at whoever knelt below. Francis kneeled there one day, we are told, in a posture of real anguish, praying the prayer every soul in the middle of conversion eventually prays, Lord, what do you want from me? And the eyes of that crucifix, Il Poverello would swear to this the rest of his life, and every brother who ever heard him tell it believed him utterly. The eyes of that crucifix looked at him, and the mouth spoke. Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling completely into ruin. Now here is a thing about our Il Poverello that the Church has never wanted to sand down into false polish. He misheard it, gloriously, humanly misheard it. He looked up at the flaking plaster, the collapsing roof beam, the weeds working through the floor of that little chapel, and he thought Christ was talking about stones. So he did what any literal, big-hearted, not yet wise young man would do. He went and got stones. He went home first, though, and here the story turns from strange grace to real trouble. He took bolts of his father's finest cloth, the very silk and scarlet that had made Pietro Bernadone's fortune and his son's whole boyhood, loaded them on a horse, and rode to the market at Foligno, where he sold both the cloth and the horse for a tidy sum. He brought the money back to San Damiano and tried to press it into the hands of the old priest, asking to stay there and help rebuild the chapel with his own labor and this silver. The priest, who knew Pietro Bernardone and knew exactly how this would end, refused to touch it. Francis, in what may be the first sign of the wisdom that would later mark him, did not force it on him. He simply hid the money in a windowsill of the church and stayed anyway, sleeping in a hidden nook nearby, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was that his father found out. Pietro Bernardone was not a cruel man in the ordinary telling of it. He was, by every account, a man who had built something real with his own hands out of nothing, a man who loved his son fiercely in the only language he had ever been taught, which was the language of goods and standing and the family name written large across the front of a good house. When word reached him that his son and heir had sold the family's cloth to fund the repair of some ruined chapel full of vermin and a broken-down priest, it must have felt to him like watching his own life's work handed out the window to strangers. He searched the town. When he found where Francis had been hiding, he did not find the money. Francis, hearing him coming, had fled deeper still into a cave in the countryside, where he stayed for nearly a month, alone, wrestling with God and with terror in equal measure, until hunger and loneliness finally drove him back toward town. He came back thin, filthy, his clothes in tatters from the cave and the fields, and the boys of Assisi, the very boys who had once followed him gladly through the streets, who had crowned him king of their feasts, now threw stones at him and called him pazzo, madman, in the open square. He had been the golden one, now he was the joke of the town. Both things were true of the same body in the space of a single season, and Francis, remarkably, seems to have let both wash over him without either one deciding who he was. His father dragged him home by force. What followed was not gentle. Francis was beaten and then chained in a dark storeroom of his own house, kept there like a prisoner, while Pietro tried to argue, threaten, and finally starve some sense back into him. It was his mother Pica, who could not bear it, who waited until her husband left town on business and quietly unlocked the storeroom door and let her son go free. Whatever else we do not know about her, we know that. She let him go. But Pietro was not a man to let a dad or a son simply walk away. He went to the civic authorities first, demanding Francis be formally disinherited and made to return the money from the sale. When that proved slower than his fury could stand, he brought the matter before Guido, the Bishop of Assisi, in the town's public square, in front of God and everyone, to settle it once and for all. Give back what is mine, and be done with this madness. And so we come to the square. You must picture it plainly, because nothing about what happened there was symbolic to the people standing in it that day. It was simply strange and shocking, the kind of scene a whole town remembers for the rest of its life and tells its grandchildren about, with a shake of the head. Francis came before the bishop, and without argument, without a single word of defense, he went and fetched the money he had hidden and set it down. That paid. That alone might have satisfied his father and ended the matter with everyone's dignity more or less intact. Francis was not finished. He took off his clothes, not down to a modest undergarment for the crowd's comfort. The record insists he stripped entirely, standing there before the bishop, before his father, before the town that had watched him grow from cradle to king of the feast, with nothing on his body at all. He folded the silk and fine cloth he had been wearing, the last visible thread connecting him to Pietro Bernardone's house and name, and set it in his father's hands. And then he said the words that the old Franciscan family has kept close to its heart for 800 years since. Until now, I have called you Father here on earth. From now on I can say without reserve, Our Father, who art in heaven, for it is in him that I have placed all my treasure and all my trust. Bishop Guido did not scold him for the scandal of it, though it must have been a scandal, a naked man in the Piazza of Assisi with half the town looking on. Instead, he stepped down from where he sat, and this is the gesture that has always undone me most, more than the stripping itself. He took his own mantle, his bishop's own cloak, and wrapped it around Francis's bare shoulders. It is a small motion, easy to read past quickly. But think what it means. The church, in the person of her bishop, did not turn her face from the naked man in the square. She covered him. She received him exactly as he was, holding nothing back, and gave him something of her own to wear in return. Whatever this young man was becoming, the church was already saying, with that one gesture of a cloak around bare shoulders, that she would not let him go it uncovered. He belonged to her now, whatever shape his life would take. And Pietro Bernardone, we do not know what was on his face in that square, whether fury, grief, or something more complicated that has no clean name. He picked up the folded cloth his son had handed back to him and walked away. And he does not appear again by name in any story the tradition kept of his son's life. A father and a son, undone from each other in the middle of a public square, so that a different father could claim what was left standing. Francis walked out of Assisi that day, wearing only a borrowed cloak and singing the same voice that had once led the drunk young nobles through the streets in French songs of romantic love, now lifted in praise down a country road with nothing left to lose, and, as it turned out, everything still to find. He went back to San Damiano, back to the crumbling walls and the crucifix with the living eyes, and this time he understood, slowly, over years, not all at once, that the house Christ meant was larger and more broken than any single building of stone. But he held the stones anyway, with his own two hands, because obedience often begins in the plain, literal, unglamorous work right in front of you, even when God means something larger by it. He begged for stones in the streets of the very town that had thrown them at him. And brick by brick, chapel by chapel he began, without knowing the whole shape of it yet, to rebuild. The little church had no roof to speak of when Francis and his few helpers finished patching it that year, but it had a name older than anyone in Assisi could account for. Our Lady of the Angels, the people called it, though most simply said the portiuncula, the little portion, because it sat on such a small parcel of land in the plain below the town, hemmed by ivy and old chestnut trees, forgotten by everyone except the poor man now living in a hut beside it. He had rebuilt San Damiano with his own hands, and San Pietro della Spina, and now this fallen shrine belonging to the Benedictines of Monte Subasio, who let him have it because no one else wanted it. Francis wanted it badly. He loved it the way a man loves the house where he was finally allowed to rest, and he would ask at the very end of his life to be carried there to die? But on this particular morning, the 24th of February in the year 1208, the feast of St. Matthias, he was only a beggar with a rebuilt roof over his head, hearing Mass with his handful of brothers, half listening the way a man half listens to words he has heard 100 times. Then the priest read the Gospel appointed for the day from the 10th chapter of Matthew, where the Lord sends the 12 out ahead of him with nothing, no gold, no silver, no copper in their belts, no traveling bag, no second tunic, no sandals, not even a staff, for the laborer, Christ says, deserves his keep. Francis had heard those words before. He had probably heard them every year of his life, but this time they did not pass over him like weather. They struck him the way San Damiano's crucifix had struck him 3 years earlier, as a voice addressed directly to him and to no one else in the church, and he could not let the priest walk past it into the next reading. He caught the man after Mass and made him say it over again, slowly, and explain it phrase by phrase until the sense of it stood before him whole. And when the meaning had settled into him completely, he said the words that his brothers would remember and repeat for the rest of their lives. This is what I want. This is what I seek. This is what I long to do with all my heart. He did not wait until he got home to begin. He pulled off the shoes he was wearing, he set aside the staff he leaned on and the leather belt at his waist, and in their place he tied a length of common rope, the kind any farmer might use to bind a bundle of sticks, and from that day the rope became the mark of his brothers, worn low around a rough tunic, the color of undyed wool, the color, the brothers would later say, of the earth itself, so that a man wearing it looked like nothing so much as a clod of ground that had learned to walk and pray. It was not costume. Francis was not a man given to symbolic gestures for their own sake. He had tried on and discarded plenty of gestures already. The silk of a merchant's son, the mail of a soldier, and none of them had told the truth about him. This did. Barefoot, beltless, carrying nothing, he had finally found the one outfit that fit, because it was the outfit of a man who owned nothing, and therefore had nothing left to lose, and so had nothing left to fear. Here is the mercy hiding inside that morning at the Portiuncula, dear friend, and I want you to see it plainly. God did not give Francis a plan. He gave him a gospel passage, read aloud by a country priest on an ordinary weekday, and Francis had the grace to hear it as if for the first time. That is nearly the whole of his genius, if we must call it genius. Not that he invented something new, but that he refused to let the old words go stale in his ears. Most of us hear Scripture the way we hear the ticking of a familiar clock, present but unremarked. Francis heard it the way you would hear your own name called across a crowded market. He turned. And once he had turned, everything he did next flowed out of that single moment with the plain logic of water running downhill. If the Lord sent his friends out with nothing, then Francis would go out with nothing. If the laborer deserved only his keep and not his wages, then Francis would beg his bread and never touch a coin again as long as he lived. The shape of the whole calling, poverty, preaching, the open road, the joy of owning nothing under heaven but the sky itself, was settled that morning in a ruined chapel none of the great families of Assisi would have troubled to visit. God, as ever, had chosen the smallest room in town to say the largest thing. He did not stay alone in that gladness for long. Within weeks a man came looking for him, not a beggar, not a fellow eccentric, but Bernard of Quinteval, one of the most respected and wealthy citizens of Assisi. A man old enough to have watched Francis grow up as the merchant's spoiled son, and shrewd enough to have noticed, over these past 2 years, that something in that same young man had changed beyond all recognizing. Bernard had seen him mocked in the streets, pelted with mud and stones by boys who had once called him their Prince of Revels, and he had seen Francis take it without flinching, even smiling. The way a man might smile at rain he had long since stopped minding. That was not madness Bernard was watching, or if it was madness, it was a madness Bernard found himself wanting. So he invited Francis to supper, and then to stay the night in his own house, and set a bed for him in his own room, the better to watch him closely, because a wealthy man does not throw away his fortune on a whim, and Bernard meant to be certain before he moved an inch. Francis, for his part, suspected nothing of the test. He lay down when Bernard did, and pretended as a courtesy to sleep. But he had learned this trick already from long nights at San Damiano, and once he judged his host was truly asleep, he rose quietly and knelt by the window, and there he stayed until dawn broke over the rooftops of Assisi, repeating one prayer over and over with his whole body bent into it. Deus meus et omnia, my God and my all, nothing more elaborate than that. 4 words, said again and again until they had worn a groove in him, the way water wears a groove in stone, not by force, but by patience. Bernard, who had only pretended to sleep as well, heard every word of it. In the morning he told Francis plainly what he had seen and what he had decided. He would sell everything he owned, give it to the poor, and follow him. Francis, characteristically, did not trust his own ears at first, asked him to be sure, told him to think of what it would cost him. But Bernard had already thought, all night, with his eyes open in the dark, listening to a poor man praying, and there is no arguing a man like that out of his conviction. They walked together to the church of St. Niccolo a day or two later, and there, in the old custom of seeking God's counsel when a man could not decide his own way forward, they opened the Gospel book 3 times at random and let the pages answer for them. The first opening told him to sell all he had and give to the poor. The second told him to take nothing for the journey. The third told him that whoever would come after Christ must deny himself and take up his cross. Bernard did not need a fourth. Within days his wealth had gone out among the poor of the town in great armfuls, and the man who had once been among the richest citizens of Assisi was walking barefoot beside a merchant's disowned son and calling it the best trade he had ever made. Peter Catani came soon after, a canon of the cathedral, learned in law, a man whose opinion carried weight in Assisi's councils, and yet he too knelt down beside Bernard and asked to be received, and Francis, who had never in his life imagined himself the leader of anyone, found himself suddenly responsible for 2 men considerably his social betters, both of them barefoot now, both of them content to be nothing at all. Then came Giles, a young man of Assisi with a heart so simple and pure that the brothers would later say God had given him everything a scholar spends a lifetime reasoning toward, without ever making him sit through the reasoning. Giles, who would one day be so filled with love in prayer that he had to be watched over during Mass lest he rise straight up off the ground before the whole congregation. One by one they kept coming, drawn not by any sermon Francis preached, for he preached almost nothing yet, but by the plain fact of him, a man who owned nothing, wanted nothing, and radiated a joy that made every rich man's table look, by comparison, like a very poor feast indeed. By the time their number reached 11, 12, counting Francis himself, the same number as the 12 he had heard read aloud that February morning, though whether God arranged that number or simply let it happen this way, I will leave to him. Francis understood that a dozen wandering barefoot men could not simply go on wandering forever without some word from Rome. He was a son of the Church before he was anything else. He had no wish to found a sect, no patience for the reformers of his age who broke from Peter's successor in their hurry to be pure. Whatever this new life was, it needed the blessing of the man who held Peter's chair. So Francis sat down, in the plainest language he had, a little rule for how they would live, hardly more than a string of gospel texts stitched together, the very sentences that had governed him since that morning at the Portiuncula, and in the year 1209 he gathered his brothers and set out on the road to Rome. Picture them as the Romans, along that road, must have pictured them, 12 ragged countrymen, sunburned, dust to the knee, tunics patched and repatched, walking together toward the greatest city in Christendom to ask an audience with the Pope. They had no letters of introduction. They had no family name worth invoking, not even Francis's, since his own father would sooner have spat on the ground than vouch for him. They must have looked to the guards and clerks who crowded the antechambers of the Lateran Palace like exactly what they were, nobody at all. But God, who delights in using nobody at all to hold up everything, had already been at work in that palace before Francis ever set foot inside it. Among the cardinals attending Pope Innocent III was a man named John of St. Paul, Bishop of Sabina, who had met Francis once already, perhaps through some earlier errand, and had come away with the strange conviction that he was looking at something the Church badly needed and did not yet know it needed. It was Cardinal John who first pressed the little band's case before the Pope, and it was Cardinal John who put the hardest question to Francis directly. Was this rule of his not too severe, too poor, too far beyond what ordinary flesh could bear? And Francis answered him the way he answered every objection to poverty for the whole of his life. Not with an argument, but with trust, saying that he had not promised to keep the gospel by half measures, and that if the friars kept nothing back for themselves, Christ would keep nothing back from them. Pope Innocent III was no easy man to move. He was, by the standards of that age, or any age, one of the great political and legal minds ever to sit on Peter's chair, a pope who had summoned kings to account and reorganized half the governance of the Western Church. He had also, in these very years, watched heresy after heresy rise up across Europe, dressed in the language of poverty, movements that began by renouncing wealth and ended by renouncing the Church's authority altogether. A pope in his position had every reason for caution, and by every account he gave Francis that caution at first, hesitating over a rule so bare it seemed to leave no room for the ordinary weakness of ordinary men. And then, the tradition tells us, in the quiet of that same season, Innocent had a dream. He saw, in his sleep, the great Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of all Christendom, the Pope's own cathedral, older and in its way holier even than St. Peter's, leaning, cracking, beginning to give way and topple, as though the whole weight of the church itself were about to come crashing down into ruin. And then he saw a man step forward to hold it up, not a bishop in his mitre, not a prince in armor, not a company of soldiers braced against the stone, but one small, poor man, alone, setting his shoulder beneath the falling wall and bearing the whole collapsing weight of it on himself until it stood firm again. When Francis came before him again, ragged and barefoot in that hall of marble and gold, Innocent III looked at him and knew him. This was the man from the dream, the church that seemed, in those turbulent years, forever on the verge of crumbling under the weight of its own wealth and quarrels and compromises, would be held up not by more wealth, not by more soldiers, but by a beggar who owned nothing at all, because a man with nothing to protect has both hands free to bear a weight, while a man guarding his own possessions has always one hand occupied in the guarding. The Pope, who had hesitated, now rose, embraced Francis, and gave his verbal approval to the little rule and to the life it described, charging the brothers to preach repentance wherever they went, and promising that when their numbers had grown and the Church's law required it, he would grant them a fuller written approbation. It was enough. Francis had not come to Rome for documents. He had come for the Church's blessing on the marriage he had already made with Lady Poverty, and now he had it, sealed not by parchment, but by the embrace of Peter's own successor. There is a mercy in that dream I want you to sit with for a moment, before we walk back down the road to Umbria with the brothers. Innocent III did not dream of a cathedral shored up by more gold, more law, more careful administration, though he possessed all three in abundance and used them well. He dreamed of a poor man's shoulder. God, it seems, is forever choosing the smallest available shoulder to bear the largest available weight, not because he needs the small thing, but because he wants us to see unmistakably whose strength was doing the holding. 12 barefoot men had walked into Rome with nothing but a handful of gospel verses stitched together into a rule, and they walked out with the blessing of the Vicar of Christ ringing in their ears. They went back to Umbria singing, I have no doubt, the way Francis had always sung. And somewhere along that dusty road south, the little brotherhood that had begun with one man kneeling before a broken crucifix became, in the eyes of the whole Church, a family with a future, though not one of them, walking home in their patched tunics, could have guessed how far that family would travel before Francis breathed his last. Somewhere on the road, between Bevegna and Canara, in the spring of 1213, Francis stopped walking so suddenly that the brothers behind him nearly walked into his back. A flock of birds had settled in the trees along the road and in the stubbled field beside it, doves, crows, a scattering of smaller birds whose names no one bothered to record. More birds than the brothers had ever seen gathered in one place, as if the whole company of the air had decided to hold council there that morning. Francis left the road without a word and walked in among them. And the birds did not fly. He greeted them the way he greeted everyone, as brothers, and then he preached to them, reminding them, so the earliest brothers remembered it, that they owed their Creator thanks for the sky that was theirs to move through without toil, for feathers finer than any king's robe, for the food they never had to sow or reap, since God fed them anyway. The birds, Thomas of Celeno tells us, stretched their necks and opened their beaks and looked at him, and did not stir until he had blessed them and given them leave to go. Then they rose together into the sky in the shape of a cross before scattering to the four winds. The brothers who witnessed it never forgot it, and neither did the Church. It is the image people reach for first when they picture Il Poverello, the saint who preached to the birds, and it deserves its fame because it holds the whole of him in one small scene. He did not preach to the birds as a curiosity or a trick of holiness. He preached to them because he believed all the way down that the gospel was too large to be folded and fitted only to human ears. If Christ had come to redeem all that was made, then all that was made had a right to hear the news. That conviction did not stay confined to fields outside Umbrian towns. It carried him, and it carried the brothers he sent walking 2 by 2 down every road out of Italy, across the Alps into France and Germany, over the Pyrenees into Spain, across the water into England, young men in patched habits with no letters of introduction and no coin in their purses, trusting that the God who fed the birds would feed them too. Some were mocked, some were beaten. Some, in Morocco a few years later, would be put to death for refusing to be silent about Christ, the first martyrs the young order gave to heaven. News that reached Francis and, by every account, filled him less with grief than with a kind of holy envy. He wanted that crown for himself. He very nearly got it. By the summer of 1219, the world had handed him an opening large enough to walk through. The Fifth Crusade had been grinding on for 2 years by then. Armies of Christian Europe encamped on the marshy delta of the Nile outside the Egyptian city of Damietta, laying siege to its walls, while fever and heat and boredom did as much damage to the camp as any Saracen arrow. Francis went out to that camp not to fight. He had never once, in all his years, blessed the sword, but because the camp was full of Christians, and Christians were where he belonged. What he found there sickened him. In August, against his open counsel, the Crusader army launched an assault that ended in slaughter, thousands of Christian dead scattered on the sand outside walls they never breached. Francis had begged the commanders not to attempt it. He wept, the sources say, when the wounded were carried back. Out of that grief came a decision so audacious that even the brothers who loved him best must have gone pale hearing it. He would cross the lines, he would walk, unarmed, into the camp of the Sultan of Egypt, Malik al-Kamil, and preach Christ to him face to face. He took one companion, Brother Illuminato, and set out toward the Saracen camp under a sky that offered him nothing but the certainty that soldiers on both sides of that war expected any Christian who crossed those lines to lose his head for it. Francis expected it too, and by every account welcomed the prospect. He had wanted martyrdom since the day he first heard the story of the friars in Morocco, and here at last he must have thought was the door standing open. Sultan al-Kamil's own soldiers seized the 2 friars as they approached, beat them, bound them, and dragged them before their lord, assuming they had captured spies or madmen. It would have taken very little for the encounter to end there, in the sand, with 2 more Christian bodies added to a summer already full of them. Instead, something happened that neither army's chroniclers quite knew what to do with afterward. The Sultan received him. Malik al-Kamil was, by every account that has come down to us, a cultured and devout man, curious about the strange little friar who had walked into a war camp with no weapon and no fear, offering to prove the truth of Christ by walking into fire if the Sultan's own religious teachers would walk into it beside him, an offer his advisers quietly declined to accept, and which the Sultan, with what sounded very much like genuine respect, did not press. What followed instead were days, the exact number is not recorded, though tradition remembers it as more than a few, of conversation between the 2 of them, the poor man of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt, on matters of God and faith and the world, conducted with a courtesy that startled everyone who witnessed it. Francis did not convert the Sultan. He did not intend deception, and he did not soften what he believed for the sake of comfort. The sources are firm that he preached Christ crucified plainly, holding nothing back. But something in his bearing, that same unguarded, defenseless directness that had disarmed the Bishop of Assisi and the Wolf of Gubbio and his own father before an entire piazza, reached the Sultan in a way that swords and siege engines never had. When the time came to part, Al-Kamil pressed gifts on him, gold, fine cloth, provisions for the journey home. Francis, faithful as ever to his lady poverty, would not carry away wealth from a war camp any more than he would have carried it away from a wedding feast in Assisi. He accepted almost nothing. One gift he did keep, by most tellings, was a small ivory horn, the kind used in the Sultan's own court to call the faithful to prayer. And it is said he treasured it afterward and had it sounded to call the brothers to table, a small, strange trophy of a meeting that had ended not in blood but in something closer to friendship. The Sultan, for his part, arranged safe passage for Francis and Illuminato back through the lands, unharmed, unransomed, free. He did not get his martyrdom. He got something quieter and, in the long run, rarer. The living proof that the gospel could cross a battlefield without a single sword being drawn, that two men who prayed to God by different names could sit together for days and part in peace. 8 centuries of popes have pointed back to that meeting on the Nile whenever they have needed to remind the world that the poor man's courage was never the courage of conquest. It was the courage of a man so certain of what he carried that he no longer needed a weapon to carry it. He came home from Egypt changed, older, the sources agree, in more than years. He had seen what war did to men on both sides of it, had watched the failure of an army that called itself Christian, and had wondered, more than once in those years, whether the whole vast machinery of crusade had drifted very far from the manger where it all began. Something in him, after Damietta, turned back toward that manger with a hunger that would not be satisfied until he had built one with his own hands. He got his chance at Greccio in the Rieti Valley on the Christmas Eve of 1223. The town sat tucked into a fold of hills a day's walk from Rome, and Francis had loved the place for years, loved the particular cave in the hillside above it, where he had gone to pray in silence more than once. That December, with the Pope's own blessings sought and given, he sent word ahead to a nobleman of the town, Giovanni Velita, asking him to help prepare something Francis had been turning over in his heart. Not a sermon this time, not a story told from a pulpit, but a scene built out of straw and bread and firelight, so that the people of the valley could see with their own eyes what it might have looked like on the night their salvation was born poor. Velita gathered what was asked of him, hay piled into a manger, an ox and a donkey led in from the fields, torches enough to light the hillside path after dark. Word went out through Greccio and the villages around it, and on the night itself the whole valley came walking up that hill, with candles and lanterns in their hands, so that from a distance, the brothers said, the mountainside looked lit with stars that had come down to keep the vigil themselves. Francis stood at that manger, vested as a deacon. He had never sought the priesthood, keeping himself always among the lesser brothers, even at the altar, and sang the Christmas gospel with a voice those present remembered, that broke and caught with tears before he was through it. Then he preached, and preached the way he always had, in that plain Umbrian speech that needed no Latin to move a farmer's heart, on the poverty of the child of Bethlehem, on the straw and the cold and the greatness that had hidden itself inside such smallness. People wept who had not wept in church in years. A soldier of the town, a knight named John, who had come that night more from respect for Francis than from piety, would swear afterward that he saw, in the hay of that manger, a child lying asleep, and that when Francis bent to lift him, the child stirred and woke, as if roused by love out of a long sleep the world had let it fall into. Whatever else was seen and unseen that night in the torchlight, one thing needed no vision to confirm it. The valley had remembered, all together and all at once, how to kneel. Greccio's hillside became, that Christmas, the first crèche the Christian world had ever built, the seed of a devotion that would spread into every parish and every home in the centuries after, wherever a family set a manger under its tree and gathered around it to remember the same poor bird. It began with straw borrowed from a nobleman's barn, and the poor man too moved to finish singing his own gospel. Look at the shape of those years together. Birds bending their necks in a stubbled field, a sultan and a beggar talking for days under an Egyptian sky, a whole Umbrian valley climbing a dark hill with candles in their hands, and you will see that it was never three different gestures. It was one gesture, made over and over, in every direction the world would let him reach. He did not preach to birds because he had run out of people. He did not sail to Egypt because he had grown tired of Italy. He did not build a manger at Greccio because he needed a spectacle. He did all of it because he believed, without a flicker of doubt, that the love which had emptied the young merchant's son of every comfort he owned was not a private treasure to be hoarded in one man's heart. It was fire, and fire does not stay where it is lit. It reaches. It was reaching still that Christmas at Greccio, out past the hills of Rieti, toward the mountain not far away, where the fire in him was about to be answered by a fire not his own. Picture the plain below Portiuncula in the year 1221, friend, and you will understand why Francis wept before he ever climbed the mountain. 5,000 brothers, some say. Perhaps the number has grown a little in the telling, the way numbers do when a memory is too big for its container, came down out of the hills of Umbria and beyond, from France and Spain and Germany, and pitched their shelters of woven reed and mud on the plain around the little chapel where it had all begun. They called it ever after the chapter of Metz, for the huts they slept in, laid out in rows like a vast poor man's village, brothers 3 and 4 to a mat, begging their bread from the villages of the Spolito Valley, who came out laden with bread and wine and cheese for these ragged men who had within a decade become a small nation without a country. Cardinal Ugolino was there, watching, a great friend to Francis and a great warrior over him too, a man who loved Il Poverello with his whole heart and could not quite believe that heaven meant for such a fire to be left untended by structure. And Francis stood in the middle of it, this multitude that had grown out of his one small yes at San Damiano, and he did not know any more all of their faces. That is the ache of this chapter, friend, and I will not soften it, because Francis did not soften it to himself. He had asked for nothing but to follow the gospel naked, to have no possessions, no house he could call his own, no book of law thicker than the words of Christ. He had wanted a family, not an institution, but a family of 12 can eat from one pot and sleep under one roof. A family of 5,000 needs procedures, and procedures need men who are good at procedures, and those men, clerics, canon lawyers, university-trained friars who joined in these years by the hundreds, began, with entirely loving intentions, to ask questions Francis had never thought to ask. Should the brothers own books, at least the necessary ones, for study? Should they have proper houses, since huts of water fall down in the rain and brothers sicken? Should there be dispensations, exceptions, a graduated understanding of poverty that a novice from Paris could actually live by? Francis heard these questions, and something in him went very quiet. He was not, by 1220, the Minister General of his own order in name any longer. He had resigned that office that same year, worn thin by illness and by a grief that had nothing to do with his eyes, which were failing him now too, and everything to do with watching men he loved try to make wise and moderate what he had received as a flame. He appointed Peter Catani in his place, and when Peter died within the year, the vicariate passed to Brother Elias, capable, Brilliant. A man who could organize a chapter of 5,000 souls and feed them all, which Francis, bless him, probably could not have managed on his best day. Elias would go on to build many things. Some of them, in later years, would grieve Francis's memory more than his wounds ever did. But that grief belongs to another chapter, and I will not borrow it here. What matters now is this. Francis did not fight for control. That is not how he loved. When the brothers debated the rule, and they debated it fiercely, for the rule of 1221 was long and psalm-woven and unwieldy for governance, and the shorter rule that would finally be sealed by Pope Honorius III in 1223 had to be hammered out through argument after argument, with Francis withdrawing at one point to dictate it fresh, Brother Leo and Brother Bonizo taking it down, while other friars muttered that the poor man's fasting had addled his sense of what was practical. Francis did not raise his voice in the halls of canon law. He went, instead, up mountains. He went to caves, he prayed, and when the arguing grew too loud, even for prayer to drown out, tradition tells us he cried out to God directly in something very near despair, asking why the brothers would not simply keep the gospel he had given them without gloss. I tell you this so you will understand that the man who climbed Mount Laverna in the late summer of 1224 was not a triumphant founder surveying an empire. He was a father who had, in a real sense, already let his children grow past the reach of his arms, and who carried that surrender, sore and unresolved, into the last great solitude of his life. Laverna rises steep and grey above the Casentino Valley, a shoulder of stone Count Orlando of Chiusi had given to Francis years before, half in generosity and half, I think, in the recognition that some men need a wilderness the way others need a home. Francis had come here before. But in August of 1224, with only a few brothers beside him, Leo, gentle and stubborn, the one Francis trusted most with his own frailty, Maceo, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, Angelo and Illuminato and Rufino, he came up the mountain, intending something more total than retreat. He meant to keep the fast of St. Michael, 40 days, from the Feast of the Assumption in mid-August to the 29th of September, in the pattern of Moses on Sinai and Elijah at Horeb, and, above all, in the pattern of the Lord who fasted 40 days in the desert before the devil came to tempt him with bread. Francis had spent his whole religious life imitating Christ in the particulars, his poverty, his labor, his preaching to the poor. Now, an old man at 42, sick in his eyes and his stomach, and I dare say his heart, he wanted to imitate him in this too, the emptying, the wilderness, the terrible starved clarity that comes when a body stops arguing with the soul about what it needs. He asked Brother Leo to be his companion in the strictest sense, the only one allowed to bring him bread and water once a day, the only one permitted near his cell of branches on the mountainside, and even Leo was told to come only when Francis called, and never at night unless summoned. The others kept a lower camp and prayed. Francis went further up, alone, to a rock ledge above a sheer drop, where the mountain falls away into cloud, and there he kept his converse with God, the way he had always kept it, out loud, sometimes weeping, sometimes singing, a man arguing lovingly with his beloved the way old friends argue, without fear of losing the friendship. It was their friend, near the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, the 14th of September, in that year of grace 1224, that heaven answered him in a way it has answered no one else in the whole recorded memory of the Church. Brother Leo was near the lower ledge, we are told, before dawn, and saw the mountain lit as if the sun itself had risen twice. Francis, praying at his rock, saw a figure descending toward him out of that light, a seraph, six-winged, burning, and fixed upon those wings, or within them, the form of a man crucified. I want you to sit with that image a moment, because it is stranger and more wonderful than we usually let it be. Not a comforting vision, not a gentle vision. A seraph, one of the highest order of angels, the ones who cry holy, holy, holy before the throne and cannot be looked upon by lesser creatures without being consumed, and nailed across its burning wings the wounded Christ. Joy and agony in the same descending light, so close together that Francis himself, in the tellings passed down to us, could not afterward say whether what flooded him in that moment was sweetness or suffering, because it was impossibly both at once, the way the whole gospel is both at once, the way a cross is both at once. And when the vision lifted from him, and the mountain went dark and ordinary again, Francis looked down at his own hands. There were wounds there, real wounds, in the flesh, in his hands, in his feet, and in his side, as though a lance had opened it. Not scratches. Not the marks of a man who had fallen against rock in his ecstasy, whatever some who did not love him would later whisper. Marks in the very shape and place of the 5 wounds of the crucified appearing on a mountain top in Tuscany on the body of a poor man from Assisi, 8 centuries before anyone else in the memory of the Church would receive such a seal. The first stigmata, the visible signature of a love so total that it had at last been allowed to show itself in his skin. Now here is the part of the story I love best, friend, and the part that tells you everything about who Francis was underneath the fame that would soon overtake him. He tried to hide it. He did not come down off that mountain proclaiming a miracle. He came down quiet, frightened almost, wrapping his hands in the sleeves of his tunic, pulling on stockings and crude mittens sewn by the brothers to cover the wounds in his feet and hands, wincing when he had to walk or when a brother clasped his hand in greeting and saying nothing. This was a man who all his life had begged to be forgotten, who called himself the least of all the friars, who wept when people praised him as though praise were a small violence done to the only thing he actually wanted, which was to disappear into Christ entirely and stop being seen as Francis at all. And now his body itself had become a kind of proclamation he had never asked to make. A sermon preached without his permission in the one language he could not control. His own flesh and his instinct, his whole life's instinct, was to cover it, to keep it between himself and God, to let no one make of it a spectacle. It did not stay hidden, of course. Brother Leo, who dressed the wounds and washed the blood from the bandages, saw them plainly again and again, over the 2 remaining years of Francis's life, and it is to Leo's own faithful, unglamorous testimony, a man who loved him too much to lie and too much to let the truth be lost, that we owe our surest knowledge of what happened on that mountain. Other brothers glimpsed what Francis could not always keep covered, a stain of blood through a mitten, a wince when he knelt, once, they say, the unmistakable sight of the wound in his side as he lifted his arm to bless someone, and his sleeve fell back. He asked and asked that they say nothing. Some kept a silence he begged of them until after his death. Some did not, because the thing was too enormous, in the end, to be entirely contained by one dying man's humility, however fierce that humility was. I think about that often, friend, the fierceness of a humility that would try to hide the very wounds of Christ. We might expect the opposite from a saint, a man eager to display such a favor, to let it prove him right against all his critics in the arguments over the rule, to let it silence Brother Elias and the university men with one glance at his bleeding hand. Francis did none of that. He carried the stigmata the way he had carried everything else God gave him, as a gift too large to be about himself, a mark of Christ's love rather than a medal for his own holiness. And if anything, the wound seemed to have deepened his sorrow rather than crowned his pride, because now his body bore, quite literally, the same brokenness the order itself was struggling under. Something too great, too costly, too far beyond what one small man could manage alone, given to him anyway, because that is how God gives. He came down from Laverna that autumn, a changed man in body, and changed too, I think, in what he now understood the whole of his life to have been circling toward from the very start. Not simply a call to rebuild a falling chapel with his own two hands, though it had begun exactly there. Not simply a call to found brothers or preach to sultans or embrace lepers, though he had done all of that too, gladly, without counting the cost. The whole of it, San Damiano, the ragged habit, Lady Poverty embraced like a bride, the brothers running from every province of Christendom to join him, even the grief of watching the order outgrow his arms, all of it had been leading here, to a mountain and a burning seraph and 5 wounds that made him, at last and forever, a living icon of the crucified he had loved since he was a young man, weeping before a painted cross in a ruined chapel outside the walls of Assisi. He would live not quite 2 more years after Laverna. His body, never strong, now bore fresh and constant pain alongside the eyes that were failing him toward blindness, and he bore it as he had borne everything, singing more than complaining, though the complaining, when it came, was honest and unhidden too. He was no plaster saint even in his suffering, friend, and we do him no honor pretending otherwise. But something had settled in him on that mountain that no argument over rules or houses or dispensations could ever again fully disturb. He had asked once at the very beginning of his conversion to know Christ and Him crucified. Heaven had taken him quite literally at his word. The rain that day came sideways, the kind that finds the seam in a hood and runs cold down the collarbone, no matter how you turn your face from it. The road between Perugia and Assisi was mud to the ankle, and Francis walked it with Brother Leo, the little priest he loved best and trusted with the things he could not yet say to the whole brotherhood. Both men were soaked through, both were hungry, and Francis, walking, began to teach, not from a pulpit, not to a crowd, but to one tired friar slogging beside him in the wet, because that was where Francis did his best theology, on the road, in the cold, with nobody performing for anybody. "Write, Leo," he said, "write what true joy is." And then he began, as the story has come down to us, to strip away every false answer before he gave the true one. "Suppose," he said, "that every friar in every province became a model of holiness. That is not perfect joy. Suppose a friar gave sight to the blind, cast out demons, raised the 4 days dead, not perfect joy. Suppose he knew all languages, all science, all the secrets of the stars and the properties of every plant and beast, still not perfect joy. Suppose he preached so well that every unbeliever in the world turned to Christ. Even that," Francis said, "is not perfect joy." Leo, walking beside him soaked to the bone, must have wondered what was left. Then Francis told him, "Picture us arriving," he said, "at a friary on a night like this one, filthy, frozen, starving, and the brother at the gate does not know us and demands to know who we are, and we say we are 2 of the brothers, and he calls us liars and vagabonds and slams the door and leaves us in the snow until midnight. And if we bear that, the cold, the anger, the insult, the shut door, patiently, without complaint, without losing charity toward the brother who wronged us, believing in our hearts that he has been given true discernment about us by God. That, Francis said, that is perfect joy. I have sat with that story for a long time, friend, and I will tell you plainly, it does not compute. Not by any arithmetic the world hands us at birth and trains us to trust for the rest of our lives. That arithmetic says joy is addition, more comfort, more praise, more certainty, more control, and sorrow is subtraction of the same. Francis is telling Leo something that breaks the equation clean in half. He is saying that joy does not live in what happens to you at all. It lives somewhere else entirely, in the marriage of your will to Christ, so complete that even the door slammed in your face becomes somehow a room you can live in with gladness. That is not Stoicism. Stoicism grits its teeth and endures. Francis is not enduring. He is delighted. And a man cannot be taught to be delighted by cold and insult and a shut door unless something in him has already been given away entirely, unless he has already, in some prior and deeper transaction, wed himself to something the world cannot touch. That something had a name, and Francis gave it to her the way a young man gives a name to the woman he intends to marry. He called her Lady Poverty. You have to understand, he did not mean by this what the word usually drags in behind it, deprivation, misery, the grey absence of things. He meant a person. He courted her the way the old troubadour songs he'd loved as a boy in the cloth shop had taught him to court a lady, with total abandon, with reckless devotion, with the conviction that she alone among all the ladies in the world was worth a man's whole life. The brothers who wrote of him afterward remembered him saying that poverty had been the bride of Christ himself from the manger to the cross, and that no one in all the ages had loved her, courted her, or clung to her as Christ had, poor in the straw at Bethlehem, poor and naked on Calvary, poor between the two. If Francis wanted to belong entirely to Christ, then he understood he could not leave Christ's own bride standing alone. He would have to woo her too. He would have to make her, as strange as it sounds, his own. This is why he would never let poverty in the order become merely an unpleasant policy, a belt tightened for the sake of appearances. He wanted his brothers to fall in love with her the way he had. He wanted them to feel, in the patched wool of a habit worn thin at the elbow, in the empty purse, in the daily labor for daily bread, with nothing set aside for tomorrow, not the pinch of a rule, but the nearness of a person. A man does not resent the plainness of the house he shares with the woman he loves. He barely notices it. He is looking at her. And so Francis went to almost comic lengths to keep money itself, actual coin, from ever settling into the brother's hands like a habit. There is a story, you may have heard some version of it, of a friar who found a coin left as an offering at the altar of a church and, without thinking much of it, picked it up and set it on a windowsill, meaning some good to come of it later. When Francis learned what had happened, he ordered the brother to pick the coin back up in his mouth, carry it that way out of the church, and lay it himself on a heap of donkey dung outside the walls. It sounds harsh until you understand what Francis was teaching, which was not that money is evil in itself, but that it is exactly as valuable to a man wedded to Lady Poverty as dung is. Useful perhaps to somebody, somewhere, but nothing to build a life's affection around, and nothing, God help us, to let creep quietly into the place in the heart reserved for trust in Providence. The brothers were to work with their hands for their bread, and beg when work did not cover it, and never, under any circumstance, touch coin as though it belonged to them. Francis would rather they be thought fools by every merchant in Umbria than gentlemen of means by any of them. He held to this into his final years with a stubbornness that some of his own brothers found impossible, and we said with why, in the last chapter, the order had grown huge, had taken on houses and books and the machinery any large family needs, and men wiser in the ways of institutions than Francis pressed for a rule with room to breathe. Francis never entirely surrendered that argument, and he never entirely won it either. But whatever ground he lost in the councils and the general chapters, he never lost it in himself. To the end of his life, he wore the poorest habit in any room he entered. To the end of his life, he flinched, physically, at the sight of money handled carelessly by one of his own. He had married her. Whatever the order became, he did not intend to be found unfaithful to the bride. All of this comes to its clearest, plainest expression in the last document Francis ever gave the world, the one we call simply the Testament, dictated in the autumn of 1226 in the little hut beside San Damiano, when his eyes were nearly blind and his body was failing on every front at once, and he knew, the way the dying sometimes know things with a terrible clarity, that he would not see another spring. He was not writing a new rule. He says so himself, plainly, near its close. Let no one say this is another rule, for it is a remembrance, an admonition, an exhortation, and my testament, which I, little brother Francis, make for you, my brothers, that we may observe in a more Catholic way the rule we have promised the Lord. He knew there would be arguments after he was gone about what he had really meant, what could be softened and what could not, and so before he died he sat, or lay, in that dark hut and dictated one last time, in his own voice, without a lawyer's caution and without a diplomat's courtesy, exactly what he had meant from the beginning. Listen to how it opens, not with doctrine, not with a claim to authority, but with a memory, plain as a man telling an old friend how he first fell in love. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers, and the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, that which had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. He does not begin with San Damiano. He does not begin with his father's fury or the bishop's cloak. He begins with the lepers, with the moment the whole world's arithmetic of disgust got overturned in him, because that, in his own reckoning at the very end, was where the marriage truly began. Before the crucifix ever spoke a word to him, God had already started rearranging what counted as bitter and what counted as sweet. And then, further down this line, which I have turned over in my hands for years, the way you turn over a coin worn smooth by handling, after the Lord gave me some brothers, no one showed me what I ought to do, but the Most High himself revealed to me that I should live according to the pattern of the Holy Gospel. Not according to a plan he devised, not according to the wisdom of the age's great religious houses, all of which by his time held land and rents and libraries and the settled comfort of institutions 2 or 3 centuries old. According to the pattern of the Gospel, bare, unglossed, taken at its word. And he goes on, in that same plain voice, to beg. There is no other word for it. He begs his brothers to hold to it after he is gone. Let the brothers take care not to receive churches or dwellings or anything built for them, unless it accords with the poverty we have promised in the rule. And let them always be as guests there, as pilgrims and strangers. Let those who do not know a trade learn one, not for the sake of earning money, but for the sake of good example and to drive off idleness. And let the reward for the work be food, not money, since money is worth no more to us than dust. And this above nearly everything else. This line that carries in it the whole ache of a man watching, from his deathbed, the machinery he unwillingly helped build begin to move under its own weight. I strictly command all the brothers not to receive letters from the Roman court, seeking privileges, the very shortcuts, the very protections and exemptions that the growing order would come, in time, to lean on more and more. It is a hard document to read without your chest tightening, because you can feel in it a man losing, in real time, an argument he cannot bear to lose gracefully, and yet refusing absolutely, to let his last word be one of bitterness. He does not curse the brothers who pushed for a gentler rule. He blesses them. He commands obedience to the ministers, obedience to the church, obedience even to a rule now inevitably shaped by hands other than his own. What he will not do is pretend the marriage never happened, or that its vows had been merely a young man's excess to be tidied away with age. Whatever the order becomes, he is saying, in that hut, half-blind, weeks from death, let it be remembered that I loved her first, and I loved her whole, and I am asking you, with whatever authority a dying man's plain word still carries, not to let her go. That is the register the whole chapter of his teaching lives in, from the mud road with Leo to the deathbed dictation, not scolding, not a program of austerities to be greeted through, but courtship all the way down. Every patched habit, every refused coin, every night spent in the cold rather than seek out comfortable lodging was a love letter, and he wrote in the same way a man writes love letters at 17 and at 70, without embarrassment, without moderation, utterly convinced the beloved is worth the whole extravagant foolishness of it. And here is the mercy in it, friend, the thing I want you to carry out of this chapter more than any single fact. He is not asking you to be poor because poverty is virtuous in itself, some grim spiritual weightlifting. He is telling you that everything, every possession, every certainty, every carefully managed identity you have built to keep the cold out, takes up room that could otherwise be filled with God, and God, given room, does not trickle in. He floods. Francis emptied his hands of coin, and his shoulders of the fine cloth, and his name of his father's ambitions for it. And what rushed into the space it cleared was a joy so unreasonable it could stand in the snow, hear a door slam in its face, and call that perfect. He was not a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had married everything that mattered, and mattered so completely that when, not long after, he climbed a lonely mountain called La Verna, seeking to be poor of one thing more, his own untouched flesh, he was only doing, at last, what the wedding had always pointed toward. The friars did not build a wall high enough to keep the world from finding San Damiano. Clare had asked for exactly that, a wall, a grill, a silence, and for 41 years she got it. Kneeling on the stone floor of the little church Francis had rebuilt with his own hands, in the same crumbling sanctuary where the painted Christ had once opened his mouth and spoken. But walls, in the end, could not hold what Francis had started any more than a bowl can hold a fire. It only looks contained. Give it time, and the rags will burn through, and the flame will go wherever it wants to go. Let me tell you about Clare first, because you cannot understand what Rome did to Francis 2 years after his death without understanding what he left behind in that small enclosure, still burning. She was 18 the night she ran from her father's house on Palm Sunday, and Francis and the brothers met her by torchlight at the portiuncula, and cut off her hair with their own hands, and clothed her in a rough tunic, and gave her to God the way a bride is given, utterly, without holding anything back for later. Her family came for her twice, with force, meaning to drag her home and marry her off the way they had planned all along. And both times she clung to the altar and would not be moved, and both times they left without her. That is not a woman drifting into a vocation. That is a woman who had already decided, and would go on deciding, for the rest of her life in 100 smaller confrontations that never made it into any chronicle. San Damiano became hers. Francis gave her that ruined chapel to make into a home for the women who came after her. His own sister in blood, in spirit if not in flesh, Agnes, came within days. More followed, and he called them simply the poor ladies. He wrote for them a short form of life, mostly borrowed, mostly silence about the details, because in truth he did not know, in those early years, quite what shape a community of women vowed to Lady Poverty ought to take. There was no precedent. Enclosed nuns in that century held property, dowries, rents. That was simply how a convent survived, how it fed itself and kept its doors from falling in. Clare did not want to survive that way. She wanted what Francis wanted, nothing. Not a field, not an endowment, not a guarantee against hunger. She wanted the same total, reckless trust that had carried Francis past the leper on the road and into the arms of a God who did not let him starve. Popes did not like this idea. Not because they doubted her holiness. Nobody who met Clare doubted her holiness, but because a community of enclosed women with no income of any kind seemed, to the practical churchmen of the 13th century, less like sanctity and more like a slow-motion catastrophe. Gregory IX, who loved her, who had loved Francis, and would go on loving what Francis left behind for the rest of his long life, tried more than once to persuade her to accept some small revenue, some cushion against disaster, the way every other religious house in Christendom had done since religious houses were invented. Clare would not have it. She fought for what she called the privilege of poverty, the way Francis had fought his own father in the piazza, not with anger, but with a stillness nothing could move. She got her privilege from the Pope. Then she spent the last months of her life fighting to get her own rule approved, the first rule in the history of the Church written by a woman for women, built on the single, non-negotiable foundation that the Sisters of San Damiano would own nothing, individually or in common, ever. She was dying while she fought for it. The record says she had been ill for most of 30 years, some wasting sickness that kept her bedridden through long stretches, though it never once kept her from governing her sisters with a clarity and gentleness the whole valley came to depend on. In August of 1253, with death close enough that everyone around her bed could see it coming, word arrived that Pope Innocent IV had signed her rule. She kissed the papal bull, they say, before she would let it out of her hands. 2 days later she died with it beside her at San Damiano, in the same small room where she had spent 4 decades keeping a fire lit that the whole world had told her, gently and not so gently, could not survive on air alone. It did survive. It survives still, in enclosures scattered across every continent. Women who have never seen Assisi and never will, kneeling in the same total emptiness Clare knelt in, trusting the same God. That is the first thing Rome had to reckon with in the years after Francis died. Not a memory, not a relic, but a woman a few hundred yards from his tomb who would not let his poverty be softened, watered down, made comfortable. She outlived him by 27 years and spent every one of them making sure nobody forgot what he had actually asked for. Now to Rome itself and to the swiftness of what happened there, because it is a strange and telling thing how fast the Church moved to declare formally, publicly, before the whole of Christendom, that this ragged man who had begged bread from door to door was a saint. Ugolino di Conti had been Francis's friend and protector since the earliest years of the order. The cardinal the brothers turned to when Rome's bureaucracy grew too tangled for a barefoot man in a patched habit to navigate alone. The churchman who stood beside Francis through the drafting and redrafting of the rule, who understood better than almost anyone in the Curia what Francis actually was. In March of 1227, less than 6 months after Francis's death at the Portiuncula, Ugolino was elected pope. He took the name Gregory IX. He did not wait long. Popes of that century often let decades pass before formal canonization, the process of gathering witnesses, verifying miracles, weighing a life against the Church's exacting standards for sanctity took years, sometimes generations. Gregory gave Francis less than 2. On the 16th of July, 1228, Pope Gregory IX came to Assisi himself. He did not send a legate, he came. He stood before the church of San Giorgio, the same small church where the boy Giovanni had once been sent to school to learn his letters. The same church where Francis's body had first been laid after his death, while the great basilica was still only a plan on paper. And there, before the assembled bishops and cardinals and the whole town that had once thought Francis mad, Gregory pronounced him a saint of the universal church. Witnesses said the Pope wept as he spoke. Whether that detail comes down to us exactly as it happened, or softened a little in the telling, I could not swear. But I will tell you it does not surprise me in the least. He was not weeping over a stranger. He was weeping over a friend, and over what that friend had asked of him once, years before, when Ugolino the Cardinal had tried gently to steer Francis toward the rule with fewer hard edges, a poverty with a little more give in it, and Francis had looked at him and said that God had called him by a new way, a way of simplicity, and that God would ask the brothers to walk no other road. Ugolino had yielded then. He was still yielding, in a sense, on the day he canonized him, bending the whole machinery of the Church to bless what he had once tried, out of love and caution both, to soften. The very next day, the 17th of July, Gregory laid the first stone of the great basilica that would rise on the hill above Assisi to hold Francis's body, a hill the people of the town had once called, with a shudder, the Hill of Hell, because criminals were executed there, and had renamed. Once Francis was buried in its soil, the Hill of Paradise. Brother Elias oversaw the building, first the lower church, driven straight into the rock like a crypt, dim and close and solemn, and then, rising above it, the upper church, filled with light, its walls eventually given over to Giotto and the painters who came after him to tell Francis's story in fresco for pilgrims who could not read a word of Latin but could read a picture, the dream of Innocent III holding up the falling Lateran, the sermon to the birds, the stigmata blazing on the mountain of Laverna. Some of the brothers who had walked beside Francis in his poverty looked at that rising basilica, its cut stone and its vaulted ceilings, and wondered, not without pain, whether the poor man of Assisi would have recognized the shrine his brothers built to house him. It is a fair question, and the order has never entirely stopped asking it, but bury him they did, in secret at first. Elias hid the exact location of the body for fear of theft, a real danger in that century when the bones of saints were valuable enough to steal. And there Francis rests still, deep in the rock beneath the basilica that bears his name, while millions of pilgrims each year walk the town above him, not fully realizing how near they are standing to the man himself. 2 years from death to sainthood. I do not know a faster canonization in the history of the Church for a man of no rank, no office, no family name worth mentioning outside Assisi. Rome moved that fast because Rome already knew. It did not take 20 years of inquiry to discover what half of Umbria had watched happen in broad daylight for 2 decades. The leper embraced. The lepers' hospitals filled with brothers who chose that work when every other order in Christendom fled it. The wolf of Gubbio tamed by nothing but a promise kept. The Sultan received without a sword drawn on either side. The wounds of Christ opening in a living man's flesh on a mountain above Laverna in front of witnesses who never afterward doubted what they had seen. Sainthood, for Francis, was not a verdict the Church reached slowly after long deliberation. It was a fact the Church was simply, finally, catching up to. And there the story might have settled, the way most stories of medieval saints settle, into stone, into feast days, into a basilica that draws crowds, and a name that fills baptismal registers century after century. Francesco, Francesca, passed down through Italian families the way it has been passed down since the 13th century, a lovely and quiet kind of immortality. It would have been enough. Any saint would be grateful for it. But God, as Francis himself never tired of insisting, is not stingy, and does not let a fire like that one burn down to embers just because 800 years have gone by. On the 13th of March, 2013, in the Sistine Chapel, under Michelangelo's ceiling, the cardinals of the Catholic Church elected a new pope, an Argentine Jesuit, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, a man known in his own diocese for riding the bus, for visiting the slums himself instead of sending priests in his place, for living not in the Archbishop's palace, but in a small apartment where he cooked his own meals. When the vote reached the necessary majority and he accepted, the cardinal seated beside him, Claudio Umes, a Brazilian Franciscan, leaned over and embraced him and said to him simply, "Do not forget the poor." Bergoglio has told the story himself more than once in his own words. How those words lodged in him instantly, how his mind went immediately to Francis of Assisi, to poverty and to peace, for the world was at war in more places than anyone could count, and to the care of creation, for the earth itself was groaning under harm no one seemed able to stop, and how, thinking of all three at once, poverty and peace and creation, he thought of the one man in the whole history of the Church who had given his life entirely to all three, and he knew, before he had finished thinking it through, what name he would take. When the Church asked him, in the old formal way, by what name he wished to be known, he said, "Francesco, Francis." No pope in over 1,000 years of the papacy had ever taken that name before him, not once. Cardinals had considered it over the centuries and set it aside, too large a name, some said, too total a claim to live up to, a name that dares the man who wears it to actually mean it. Bergoglio took it anyway, on the first try, without hesitation, standing in the same room where cardinals had elected popes for 500 years. And by taking it, he did something Ugolino di Conti had done in a smaller way back in 1228. He bent the whole visible machinery of the Church one more time toward the ragged man of Assisi and said, in effect, "This is the shape I want my whole papacy to take. Smallness, poverty that is chosen, not merely endured. A door left open for whoever knocks, sinner or saint, and a determined, stubborn refusal to let the poor of the world be forgotten the way the world is so practiced at forgetting them." 800 and some years, and the fire had not gone out. It had only been waiting the way fire in a good bed of coals will wait through a long, cold night for someone to come along and blow on it. Clare blew on it at San Damiano, refusing every comfortable compromise for 41 years behind a wall she chose herself. Ugolino blew on it in Assisi, weeping in front of San Giorgio 2 years after his friend was in the ground. And on a March evening in Rome, an Argentine Jesuit stepped out onto a balcony over St. Peter's Square in white, before a crowd that did not yet know what name he had chosen. And when they heard it, Francesco, something moved through that crowd that had nothing to do with novelty or surprise. It was recognition, as if the whole world, Catholic and otherwise, believer and half-believer, heard that name spoken from that balcony and understood, without needing it explained, exactly what kind of church was being promised to them. Not more marble, not more gold. A little poor man, still, after 8 centuries, telling the whole world the same thing he told the brothers who first came running to him in Assisi, that God is not far away and not stingy, and that the smallest, emptiest hands are very often the ones God chooses to fill first. Here is where I would take your hand, if I could, and walk you the last few steps myself. There is a door in Assisi, a real one, small and dark, cut into the wall of a little chapel called the Porziuncola, which now stands swallowed inside a much larger basilica built to protect it, the way we sometimes build something enormous around something we love. Forgetting the small thing was the point. Pilgrims stooped to go through it still. Francis rebuilt that chapel with his own hands, stone by stone, in the years after San Damiano first spoke to him, and he loved it best of all the places on earth, and he asked to be carried there to die. The door is low. You have to bend to enter. I have always thought that was exactly right, and not by accident, because everything about knowing Francis asks you to bend a little, to set down whatever you were carrying so straight and tall, and stoop, and go in smaller than you came. You have been bending through 8 chapters now. You have watched a merchant's son trade silk for rags and a horse for his own 2 feet. You have watched him kiss a leper's ruined hand and find, astonishingly, that the bitterness turns sweet in his mouth. You have heard the painted Christ speak from a crumbling wall, go, "Rebuild my church," and watched a young man take that command far too literally, hauling stones, before God widened his eyes to the larger house that needed rebuilding, which was the whole battered body of Christ, one soul at a time. You have watched brothers come running to him out of nowhere, as if summoned, and watched him send them out 2 by 2 with nothing in their purses, trusting a poverty so reckless it frightened even the men who loved him. You have followed him across the sea to a sultan's tent, unarmed, hoping only to be heard, and been quietly astonished that he was. You have felt the weight settle on him as the order he never meant to organize grew past counting, and felt with him the sorrow of watching something so free begin to need rules. You have watched him court Lady Poverty like a bridegroom, without a trace of irony, and watched a young noble woman named Clare leap over her family's wall in the middle of the night to marry the same poverty herself. You have stood at Rome with him, small and stammering, in a room full of cardinals, and heard the Pope call him by a name that stuck, Francesco, little Frenchman, a nickname from a boyhood he never outgrew, worn like a badge for the rest of his life. That is the portrait. It is whole. I have not left you a fragment, and I have not left you a cliffhanger. If you closed this book tonight and never opened another page about him, you would already know Francis of Assisi. You would know his laugh, more or less, and his stubbornness, and the way joy kept breaking through him like light through a cracked jug. You would know enough to love him. That has been the whole aim of these 9 chapters, not to summarize a life which cannot be summarized, but to introduce you to a man, the way you'd introduce a dear friend at a doorway before letting the two of you go off together and talk for hours. But I would be doing you a disservice, and doing Francis one too, if I let you think this door only opens onto more of what you've already seen. It doesn't. What I've given you here is the shape of the man. What waits beyond this small door is the years, the wounds, the song at the very end, and the 800 years since that have never once stopped needing him. I want to tell you honestly what's there, the way you describe a house to a friend before they walk through it, not to sell it to you, but so you know what you're stepping into, and so the choice is truly yours. The first volume waiting for you is called The Fire in the Rags, and it takes everything I have shown you here and gives it room to breathe, room and weight and dates and the particular Umbrian light I've only been able to gesture at in these pages. You will meet the boy Giovanni again, but slower this time, with his father's cloth in his hands and his father's ambition heavy on his shoulders, and you will feel, not just be told, but feel, how strange and how total the break was when he stripped off his clothes in the public square before the Bishop of Assisi and gave his father back everything, down to the coins in his purse, saying that from now on he would call no man father but God in heaven. You will sit longer with the leper. You will understand why that one kiss, so brief in the telling, marked the hinge of an entire life, and you will see how a man who could not bear the sight or smell of disease came, in time, to nurse lepers with his own hands and call them, without a trace of performance, his brothers. You will walk into San Damiano itself and stay there, and hear the whole of what Christ said to him from the cross, not just the line I have quoted you, and watch him misunderstand it beautifully before he understood it rightly. This first volume ends where our portrait only glances, at the true beginning of the brotherhood, the first ragged handful of men who heard him and could not stay away, and the moment the whole shape of the thing that would become the order of Friars Minor first flickered into being, small as a struck match in a dark room. If you want to know the young Francis in full, the merchant's son becoming il poverello, breath by breath, that is the volume where he lives. The second volume is called Brother to All, and it carries the story forward through the years of growing and multiplying and, if I am honest with you, of grieving. This is where the Order Francis, founded on nothing but trust in God's providence, becomes something enormous, thousands of brothers, spread across Italy and then across Europe, more men than one poor man could ever again gather in a room and simply love face to face. You will feel the particular ache of that, because success is not always simple, and Francis felt it too. You will follow him east to Egypt during the crusade, into the tent of the Sultan Al-Kamil, and this time you will stay long enough to see what was actually said and offered and refused, and to understand why a man with no weapon and no argument except his own peace walked into a war camp and came out again alive, respected, unconverted in his purpose, but somehow not unheard. You will watch him wrestle in his last years of active leadership with brothers who wanted rules where he wanted only love, and watch him step back from governing the order he founded because his own heart could not bear to wield authority the way authority is usually wielded. And at the center of this second volume, on a bare mountain called Laverna in September of 1224, you will come to the stigmata, the 5 wounds of Christ, breaking open in Francis's own flesh, in his hands and his feet and his side, the first time in the memory of the Church that such a thing had ever been recorded. I have not shown you that mountain in these pages. I could not. It deserves the whole quiet weight of a chapter built only for it, and it will have one. This volume also holds Clare more fully, her enclosure at San Damiano, her fierce fidelity to the poverty Francis had taught her, the letters that passed between them across a distance neither of them wanted and neither could undo. If the first volume shows you a man being converted, the second shows you what a converted man carries, and how much a single human heart can bear when it has given itself entirely away. The third volume is called The Song at the End, and it holds his dying and everything that dying set loose in the world. You will sit with him in his final illness, nearly blind, his body wrecked by years of fasting and travel, and the wounds he bore in secret, hidden under bandages even from most of his own brothers, and you will hear him, in the middle of all that suffering, compose the Canticle of the Sun, prizing Brother Sun and Sister Moon, and Brother Wind and Sister Water, and, at the very last, welcoming Sister Bodily Death herself as a sister and not an enemy. You will hear his testament in full, dictated with his own failing breath, his last plea to the brothers he loved to hold fast to the poverty and simplicity he had first shown them, spoken not as a rule from above, but as an old friend's final word, urgent and tender. You will be there at the Porciancola, that same low door, on the evening of October 3rd in the year 1226, as he asked to be laid naked on the bare earth one last time, the way he had first arrived at his conversion and died singing. And then the third volume does something the first two cannot. It keeps going. It follows the fire out past the single life that first lit it, through Clare's own death, through the centuries of friars and poor Clares and Franciscan mystics and reformers and martyrs, through the small dusty places where his poverty took root all over the world, all the way to a cardinal from Argentina who knelt before choosing his name as Pope and chose, out of every name available to him in 900 years of the Church, to be called Francis. Nobody had ever done that before. 8 centuries, and Il Poverello was still so alive that a man in the year 2013 reached for his name first. I tell you all this not to make this small book feel like less than it is. It is not less. It is the doorway, and the doorway is not a lesser thing than the house. You cannot get to the house without it, and the doorway well made is a joy in itself, a threshold worth pausing on. But a doorway is also, by its nature, not where you are meant to stay. I would be failing you, and failing him, if I let you close this book thinking you had already met the whole of Francis of Assisi. You have met him truly. You have not met him completely. No one book could do that, not even the 3 that wait for you, though together they come far closer than I ever could alone in these few pages. So here is my honest word to you, friend to friend, the way I promised you at the start. If what stirred in you across these 9 chapters was a warmth you want to sit with a while before going further, if you want to let San Damiano and the leper's kiss and Clare's leap over the garden wall settle into you slowly, the way good soil takes a long time to receive seed, then let this book rest with you, Go back through it. Read the chapter that struck you hardest again before you move on to anything else. There is no shame and no hurry in that. Francis himself was in no hurry. It took him years to become who he became, and grace does not run on our schedule. But if what stirred in you was hunger, if you find yourself wanting to know what the Sultan actually said in that tent, and what Francis said back, if you want to stand at the true foot of La Verna and feel the mountain air the way he felt it in the days before the wounds appeared, if you want his testament in full, his own voice unmediated by mine, telling you plainly why the poverty mattered so much to him, that he would not let even his own brothers water it down while he was still alive to stop them. If you want to know how a man who died nearly blind and utterly poor in the year 1226 is still, 800 years later, the name a pope reaches for, then the 3 volumes are there, and they are waiting, and they were written for exactly this moment, the moment right after this doorway, when the story has only just begun to take hold of you, and you find you are not ready to let it go. Either way, whether you linger here or walk straight on through, you have already done the one thing that matters most. You have met him. Not the plaster statue in the garden with the birds on his shoulder, sanded smooth by centuries of sentiment, but the man underneath it, stubborn, funny, wounded, reckless with love, endlessly delighted by a God he found lavish and near and good past all reasonable measure. That delight was the whole secret of him. Everything else, the rags, the poverty, the wounds, the singing at the end, was only what happened to a man who let that delight have its way with him completely. May it have its way with you too. Go in peace, friend. And if you find, some quiet evening down the road, that you're standing at a low door in Assisi with your head bent, stepping through into a small dark chapel that somehow holds more light than it should, know that Francis is glad you came. He was always glad when someone came. It was, in the end, the only thing he ever really asked for, that you would come close enough to see for yourself how good God is, and having seen it, be unable ever quite to leave it behind. Pax et bonum, peace and every good thing.